Herkese selamlar. Bugün Mesele Ekonomi'de yabancılar, yabancı yatırımcı TL'deki gelişmelere nasıl bakıyor? Merkez Bankası'nın attığı, atmadığı adımları nasıl değerlendiriyor? Bunu konuşacağız. Konuğumuz Londra merkezli varlık yönetim şirketi BlueBay'in kıdemli stratejisti Timothy Ash. Mr. Timothy Ash, thank you for joining us. Since 2018, there have been on and off episodes where the swap rates in the offshore swap market rapidly increased, or the state banks intervened into the foreign exchange rate market. How did such actions affect the foreign investors?
Well, I guess if you go back initially to kind of September 2018, when I think we saw some of that activity, and I guess at that point in time, the Turkish authorities, they did tighten, so they hiked policy rates obviously very aggressively. At the same time, I think the message was, they wanted to micromanage the market, dominate the market. And for that, I guess they wanted to push foreigners out. And actually killing the offshore swap market, made it very hard to short the lira. If you're an FX speculator, that made it very dangerous to kind of short the Turkish lira. The downside was that because it was difficult to hedge Turkish lira exposure, it also, hurt a lot of investor perceptions amongst, longer term holders of Turkish risk. For example, Turk GBs, became there was less liquidity offshore. It's more difficult to hedge your Turk GB exposure. So I guess investors, that's part of this reduction in the portfolio stock in Turkey, because, when they see the authorities, trying to micromanage and reduce your hedging opportunities, it creates frustrations among foreign investors, and essentially a lot of them, I think, decided Turkey was too difficult a market to trade, in essence, and that's, I guess, what we've seen since 2018. So this killing of the offshore market, makes it more difficult to trade. So people just don't want to hold Turkish risk. I think it was quite interesting this time around. I mean, if you think of the last couple of months, we've seen renewed pressure on the Turkish lira. You mentioned the state bank intervention. This time around, interestingly, I mean, the Turkish authorities were a little bit more. I mean, they in a way try to provide liquidity actually to holders of Turkish risk this time around. I mean, they in a way freed up some of the liquidity problems in terms of the ability to hedge your lira exposure, right? So I think they understood that the action that it took in 2018 was quite damaging in terms of the investor perceptions of Turkey, and I think they realised that they had to try and work with foreign investors to keep those investors that were still in Turkey, try and keep them invested in a way. So that was kind of encouraging. It showed a little bit of an attempt to understand the foreign investor base.
With the recent movements in the TL during the last several weeks, the spotlight is once again on the central bank. What are your expectations from the central bank?
Well, I think, we all know in the end the policies have been about growth, credit, jobs. It's been trying to support the government in terms of, generating growth, and jobs. And so it's been through the credit channel, and that's been the strategy, I guess, for last 5, 6, 7 years or so, right? And this aversion to high interest rates, obviously, Erdogan doesn't like interest rates, doesn't like usury particularly. And I think they realized that they wanted to cut policy rates, and in order to do that, you needed macro financial stability. So you needed the currency to be relatively stable. So that's what we've been seeing. We've been seeing, active intervention over the last couple of years to kind of try and keep the currency stable, sufficient to allow them to cut policy rates. Now, they figured out, I guess, that initially it was conventional FX intervention by drawdown of gross reserves. Then they saw that dollarization was continuing, increasing, and it became a risk to macro financial stability itself. So then they figured out this wheeze where basically they could swap out the FX deposits in the banking system from private banks to the central bank and then back to state-owned banks, and then use that to intervene to defend the currency. It helped support the gross reserve number, but actually, as we all know, it's left the central bank with a net international reserve position probably significantly negative now if you net out some of those swap positions. And that's a pretty uncomfortable place to be, really. So the intervention has been about trying to create FX stability to enable interest rate reductions. They did that through currency intervention, but the level of currency intervention was so extreme that actually the depletion of net international reserves itself served to undermine macro financial stability. Right? People were worried about reserve depletion. Right, so it proved counterproductive. We've seen them. Trying different FX strategies. In a way, it was kind of a crawling peg. Then we had this 685 level that they were trying to maintain for a period of time. They kind of threw in the towel seemingly about a month ago and realized that they had to let the currency adjust a bit more, and then they've obviously tightened by increasing the average funding rate by a couple of hundred basis points. So it's kind of, at the moment, it's a combination of, it's basically trying to tighten financial conditions a little bit, but at the same, hike policy rates a little bit, and at the same time letting a bit of heat out, a little pressure off the exchange rate by letting the exchange rate adjust a bit.
Do you think that the market will force the central bank into a major increase in the policy rates? For example, like 2018?
You started off by saying, you focused on Jackson Hole and global liquidity, right? So Erdogan's very often very lucky. He's a lucky politician. Often, he survived in power 20 years, and the liquidity conditions are certainly helpful for the central bank, right? That said, liquidity conditions are favourable, but at the same time, Turkey's not really benefiting very much from it. Again, I think you highlighted at the start the portfolio flow story, and really Turkey's not really seen portfolio inflows, right? So normally with lots of global liquidity, with relatively high nominal rates in Turkey, you might imagine portfolio inflows helping the central bank. We haven't really seen that, so that's kind of interesting. What concerns me is dollarization, right? So I think if you step back and look at the Turkish story, since 2018. The Turkish authorities have basically frozen foreigners out of the market, right? So this is not it's not a speculative attack by foreigners. Foreigners are really out of the market. They're a really small share of the market. The big driver at the moment for the pressure on the exchange rate is, the low interest rate, credit fueled growth, driving import demand, increasing the current account deficit. Again, today we saw the trade number for August, bad number again. And then dollarization, right? So, this continued demand by locals for FX. And why is that? It's because inflation is too high, interest rates are too low, and there's, I think, a fundamental lack of confidence in the monetary and exchange rate settings in Turkey. That's the reality. The guy on the street thinks the currency is going to continue to weaken, so why would he hold Turkish lira? Been paid at whatever it is, 11-12% at the moment in lira in banks. That's the reality. So the Turkish authorities have got to change that cycle. How do they do it? How do they give confidence to the man in the street that they can keep the currency stable enough to make it a good investment for Turks? And I don't think they can maintain the confidence. Whatever they've done in the last 2 years, dollarization's continued, right, to record highs.
Meanwhile, there are the geopolitical risks rising, for example, in the East Med or the upcoming US elections. How are such developments affecting the story?
It's interesting. You mentioned Eastern Med. There's a lot of noise, right? There's a lot going on. It's surprising the market really doesn't take more notice of it. Maybe, I get you're Turkish, I guess, right? Greece and Turkey have had tensions in that region a long time. I guess they know each other's red lines. The EU makes a lot of noise, but in the end, it rarely sanctions countries very aggressively. It needs Turkey probably than Turkey needs the EU, right? Turkey is important for migrants, for Syria, for fight against terrorism. NATO and the EU want to keep Turkey in NATO against Russia. So there's lots of reasons why I guess the Eastern Med, something of a lid is being kept on it. Although, from outside, it looks a pretty stressful area, right? With lots of regional players and global players playing games. So, I mean, I guess that's one. I think US elections is probably a bigger risk, right? I mean, Trump, for whatever reason, seems to love Erdogan, right? And you know, the US establishment clearly are not very friendly towards Turkey, you know, at the moment and for the last few years, and have really wanted to sanction Turkey, obviously about S-400s. And, you know, Trump has stopped that process, right? So if Biden comes in, I think the US establishment will be back in the driving seat. Trump will less be able to stop those kind of sanctions actions. And it's going to be quite interesting in terms of the Turkish-US relationship. I mean, how is Biden going to handle this quite tricky? There are lots of issues, there's lots of areas where Turkey and the US have competing interests.
So within such a framework, do you see any changes in the near future on the perception towards the Turkish economy?
I think foreigners, you know, generally, you know, foreigners like Turkey. I mean, foreign investors. I mean, you know, Turkey's got some really good companies, some extremely good banks, and I think, you know, Turkey's sovereign. The treasury has good ratios, right? I mean, it trades Turkish credit, so fixed income, trades very cheap. You know, it looks like there's some value there, so people want to invest in Turkey. And I think, you know, they can see through the geopolitical problems and maybe the domestic political issues as well. I mean, people do want to invest, right? I mean, Turkey, as you know, it makes things. It's a big economy. It's a dynamic economy. It's got great demographics. You know, there's lots of reasons why people want to invest in Turkey, right? And so I think, you know, they feel uncomfortable really about, you know, the monetary policy mix. I mean, it's very hard for an institutional investor to put money into Turkey when they don't trust the central bank. I mean, that's the reality. They don't trust the basic monetary policy settings. I mean, just think about this. If you think about G20, I think Turkey is the only member of G20 where the monetary policy ideology is not, you know, I think it's the only central bank where, well, the only administration in G20 where I think the authorities think that high interest rates cause inflation. You know, and that's, you know, ask any fund manager. That's complete rubbish, right? It's just utter rubbish. So it's very hard to have faith in a fixed income investment when you know that ultimately the central bank will not do what it should do at the right time. And unfortunately, that's been the experience of 2018. And it was kind of the experience so far this year, right? I mean, if you look, you know, a week or so ago, central bank had a great opportunity to hike policy rates, right? It should have hiked the base rate. Yeah, you know, the markets would have loved it. It would have been a turning point for the lira, turning point for credibility and confidence in Turkey. And they probably only needed to hike rates, you know, 200 basis points, right? So whatever, from 8.25 to maybe even just to 10, right? And I think the markets would have taken it very well, and they couldn't even hike, you know, 175 basis points, right? I mean, it was a great opportunity missed, and it kind of shows that they really learned nothing from 2018. You know, I mean, or probably more likely, they understand what happened in 2018, but they have no ability to implement an independent monetary policy, and that's the reality.
In 2018, there was also an opportunity, right?
The experience in 2018 was, and it's 2017. I mean, if they'd have tightened monetary policy in 2017, I would think if they'd have tightened monetary policy by 200 basis points in 2017, right, we wouldn't have had the crisis in 2018, and they wouldn't have had to hike interest rates, whatever, 600 basis points, right? I mean, imagine that, you know. So, and the downside is, what it means is Turkey goes through these stop-go cycles, right? I mean, Turkey, you know, should have, you know, Turkey should be, you know, pretty high in terms of EM growth tables. You know, it has lots of really strong underlying factors that would suggest relatively high potential growth, in my mind, right? And actually, you know, inflation could be relatively well contained if you just had an independent central bank who could undertake proper monetary policy, right? And you could have relatively high growth, high and stable, sustainable growth, and relatively low inflation. It could be kind of a great scenario, right? Which is why Turkey is pretty frustrating, right?
Mr. Timothy Ash, thank you for joining us.
Good to see you. Cheers, yeah.